At 0552 hours on the morning of December 10, 1941, a Japanese Mitsubishi G-3M bomber released an aerial torpedo into the South China Sea. The weapon struck the battleship HMS Prince of Wales along her port quarter, near the stern. The explosion tore open hull plating, flooded compartments, and bent the outer of her twin port propeller shafts into a warped thrashing arc. Within seconds, that shaft was hammering against its own shaft brackets, punching holes through the hull with each revolution. Water flooded inward at a catastrophic rate. The men who ran below to assess the damage found compartments already chest deep. The pumps could not keep pace. The crew who tried to manage the flooding worked in darkness, in cold salt water, in the knowledge that something had gone wrong that they did not yet fully understand. The Prince of Wales, the most modern battleship the Royal Navy had ever placed in service, was dying of a wound she should have been able to survive. She would be gone before noon. What happened in those final hours off the coast of Malaya was not simply a military defeat. It was the collision of two eras, the age of the battleship and the age of the aircraft, meeting at last in a test that left no ambiguity about the outcome. But to understand why the Prince of Wales died the way she did, with her pumps overwhelmed and her crew helpless, it is necessary to go back much further than December of 1941. It is necessary to go back to her beginning. The ship was laid down at the Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead on the 1st of January, 1937. She was the second vessel of the King George V class, the first truly modern British battleships built under the constraints of the Washington Naval Treaty and its successor agreements. Those treaties had shaped her in ways that were not entirely visible from the outside. The designers at the Director of Naval Construction had been forced into compromises that would haunt the vessel throughout her short life. The King George V class displaced approximately 42,000 tons at full load. The ships measured 227 meters in length, with a beam of 31.4 meters. 4 Parsons geared turbines drove the ship through 4 shafts, producing 110,000 shaft horsepower and a maximum speed of 28.3 knots. The armor protection was substantial by the standards of the day. A main belt of 374 millimeters at its thickest point, deck armor of between 124 and 149 millimeters over the magazines, and a complex system of anti-torpedo bulges intended to absorb and dissipate the energy of underwater explosions before that energy reached the main hull. The armament was her most distinctive and most controversial feature. Rather than the standard arrangement of 3 triple turrets that the Americans and Japanese were building into their contemporary designs, the King George V class carried a main battery of 10 14-inch guns arranged in 2 quadruple turrets, designated A and Y, fore and aft, and 1 twin turret, designated B, forward. The decision to use a 14-inch caliber had been driven by treaty obligations and by a calculated gamble that other naval powers would adhere to the same limits. When Japan refused to be bound by the 14-inch ceiling, the British found themselves with a gun battery that was outclassed by both the Japanese 16-inch weapons and the American 16-inch guns before the ships ever went to sea. The quadruple turrets themselves were enormously complex mechanisms. Each turret housed 4 guns in 2 pairs, with an elaborate system of hoists, rammers, and loading trays that had to function in precise coordination. They were the most intricate naval gun mechanisms the British had ever built. They were also deeply unreliable. Prince of Wales was launched on the 3rd of May, 1939, 5 months before Britain went to war. She was commissioned into service on the 19th of January, 1941, under the command of Captain John Catterall Leach. She had not finished her shakedown trials. She had not worked through the routine that a warship normally undergoes before being considered ready for combat. The careful process of identifying mechanical faults, exercising the crew in every system, running the machinery to failure and repairing it, testing the guns until the loaders worked with unconscious efficiency. The war did not allow for this. Within months of commissioning, she was being ordered into one of the most dangerous operations in the North Atlantic. In May of 1941, the German battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen put to sea from the Baltic, bound for the Atlantic convoy lanes. The German ships displaced over 50,000 tons combined and carried a formidable armament. The Bismarck mounted 8 15-inch guns, the most powerful battleship guns then afloat in any European navy. Intercepting them fell to the Royal Navy's home fleet. The battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of the Navy and the most famous warship in the world, sortied with the still working up Prince of Wales to intercept the German force in the Denmark Strait. Hood was old. She had been commissioned in 1920 and had never received the deck armor improvements that the experience of Jutland had made obviously necessary. Her horizontal protection was inadequate against plunging fire at long ranges, a vulnerability that every naval architect who had studied the matter understood. She was fast, she was powerful, and she was deeply beloved by the British public. She was also potentially vulnerable in ways that her commanders hoped would not matter. At 0552 hours on the morning of May 24, 1941, the two British ships opened fire on the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen in the Denmark Strait. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag in Hood, had chosen an approach course that minimized the exposure of his ships to incoming fire, but also prevented his own rear turrets from bearing on the enemy. He had made a tactical choice that prioritized closing the range quickly over maximizing firepower. It was a reasonable decision given Hood's known vulnerability to plunging fire at long distances, but it meant that the British were fighting at a disadvantage from the opening salvos. The Prince of Wales opened fire with her 10 14-inch guns. Or rather, she attempted to. Within the first minutes of the engagement, problems in the quadruple turret mechanisms caused gun after gun to drop out of action. The complex loading systems jammed. Civilian technicians from the Vickers Armstrongs Company were still physically aboard the ship, attempting to resolve mechanical faults that had not been corrected before the vessel sailed. By the time the engagement reached its climax, Prince of Wales could bring only 4 of her 10 main battery guns to bear reliably. A battleship that should have been throwing nearly 15,000 kilograms of steel at the enemy in each broadside was managing far less than half that. At 0600, after only 8 minutes of fighting, the Bismarck's 5th salvo struck the Hood. The shells from the German ship plunged through the old battlecruiser's inadequate deck armor and reached a magazine. The explosion was catastrophic and essentially instantaneous. The Hood broke apart and sank in approximately 3 minutes. Of her crew of 1,418 men, 3 survived. Captain Leach continued to engage the Bismarck with his crippled ship, scoring 3 hits on the German vessel that would later prove significant. He then made the correct decision to disengage. The Prince of Wales had already taken 7 hits from the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen. 1 shell had passed through the bridge without exploding, killing or wounding everyone around Leach himself, who survived essentially by chance. Continuing the fight with a gun battery that was barely functional against 2 undamaged opponents would have meant the loss of another British capital ship. Leach withdrew under a smoke screen, and the Royal Navy began the chase that would end with the Bismarck's sinking 3 days later. The performance of the Prince of Wales in the Denmark Strait was not, in the final assessment, cowardly or incompetent. It was the performance of a brand new, incompletely worked-up warship, thrown into a fleet action before she was ready, crewed by men who had not yet learned all the ways their ship could fail them. The Admiralty understood this. The Prince of Wales was pulled back to Scapa Flow, her mechanical faults were addressed with greater urgency, and she resumed operations. By August of 1941, she had been selected for a mission of considerable political significance. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would sail in her to Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, for a secret meeting with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The resulting Atlantic Charter was one of the foundational documents of the Allied war effort. The Prince of Wales, steaming through the North Atlantic with the Prime Minister aboard, was symbolically representing British power and British resolve at the precise moment when Britain most needed America to understand that the war was winnable. For those few days in August, she was the most important ship in the world. Churchill was photographed aboard her, standing on her quarterdeck with his officers looking out over grey Atlantic waters. The photographs were released to the public and became iconic images of the war's early years. The ship herself, still less than a year old, had already made history twice. She was not yet finished making it. The decision that sealed the fate of the Prince of Wales was made in the autumn of 1941, against a backdrop of rapidly deteriorating relations between Britain and Japan. The Japanese Empire had been expanding aggressively through China and Southeast Asia, and the fall of French Indochina to Japanese occupation in the summer of 1941 had brought Japanese air bases within striking range of British Malaya, the crown jewel of the Far Eastern Empire. The naval base at Singapore, completed at enormous expense over 2 decades, was intended to be the anchor of British power in Asia. Its usefulness depended on the presence of a fleet capable of deterring Japanese aggression. The fleet was not there. The ships that should have been there were tied up in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, fighting Germans and Italians. What the Admiralty could spare for the Far East was limited. The question was what to send. Churchill wanted to send a deterrent force. The concept was straightforward. The presence of a powerful, modern capital ship in Singapore would make the Japanese think twice before attacking British possessions. A fast, well-armed, modern battleship, visible at Singapore, would be a statement of intent that the Japanese government could read clearly. Churchill settled on sending the Prince of Wales along with the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, an older but still formidable vessel, and an aircraft carrier. The carrier, originally designated for the task, HMS Indomitable, ran aground in the West Indies during workup exercises and was unavailable. The decision was made to send the 2 capital ships anyway, without air cover. This decision has been debated by historians ever since. Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, who was given command of what was designated Force Zulu, raised the question of air cover before he sailed. He was assured that shore-based Royal Air Force aircraft would be available from Malayan airfields. He was also given to understand, or understood on his own, that the Japanese threat from the air was less dangerous than some feared. Phillips was an officer of the old school. He had served his entire career in a Royal Navy that believed fundamentally in the primacy of the capital ship. He had seen the debates about air power, had heard the claims of the air power advocates, and had not been wholly persuaded. He was not alone in this. Across the Royal Navy in 1941, there remained a significant body of opinion that believed a well-armed, well-handled warship could defend herself against air attack. The Prince of Wales carried an anti-aircraft armament that was, on paper, impressive. She had been built with anti-aircraft defense in mind. Her secondary battery included 16 5¼ dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, capable of engaging both surface and air targets. She also carried multiple 2-pounder pom-pom anti-aircraft weapons in octuple mounts, the standard close-range British anti-aircraft system of the period, plus additional smaller caliber weapons. The fire control systems for her anti-aircraft guns were among the most sophisticated then in service. She was, in purely technical terms, better equipped to defend herself against air attack than almost any other warship in the Royal Navy. What the technical specifications could not convey was the reality of anti-aircraft gunnery against determined, coordinated attack. A modern torpedo bomber approaching at low level at 240 kilometers per hour gave defending gunners a firing window measured in seconds. A high-level bombing attack required sustained, accurate fire at altitudes where fire control became extremely difficult. And a coordinated attack that split the defender's attention between multiple simultaneous threats was something that no paper specification could fully account for. Force Zulu arrived at Singapore on the 2nd of December, 1941. Admiral Phillips conferred with the local commanders. The news was not encouraging. The promised Royal Air Force fighters were in far shorter supply than anticipated. The airfields in northern Malaya were already under threat. The strategic situation was deteriorating faster than London had anticipated. On the 7th of December, Japan attacked simultaneously across a vast arc of the Pacific and Asia. Pearl Harbor was struck at 0753 hours Hawaiian time. The American battleship force was devastated. Within hours, Japanese forces were landing on the beaches of Kota Baru in northern Malaya, and Japanese aircraft were attacking Malayan airfields. Admiral Phillips faced an impossible situation. His ships were at Singapore. The Japanese were landing troops on the Malayan coast hundreds of kilometers to the north. If he did nothing, the Japanese would establish their beachheads unmolested. If he sorted, he would be taking his ships into waters where Japanese air power could reach them without adequate fighter cover of his own. He knew the risk. His staff knew the risk. At 1717 hours on December 8th, Force Zulu put to sea from Singapore. The force consisted of the Prince of Wales, the Repulse, and 4 destroyers: HMS Electra, HMS Express, HMS Tenedos, and HMAS Vampire. Phillips intended to strike at the Japanese landing beaches at Singora and Kota Baru. He maintained radio silence throughout the sortie, hoping to avoid detection. He relied on the hope that cloud cover would provide concealment during the approach. The cloud cover did not materialize as hoped. A Japanese submarine, I-65, sighted the British force at 1740 hours on the 8th of December. The report was transmitted. Japanese naval commanders in Indochina began repositioning their air assets. The situation continued to deteriorate through the 9th. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft found the British force early in the afternoon. Phillips received word that the fighter cover he had requested from Singapore would not be available. Shortly before midnight on the 9th, he received a report of Japanese landings at Kuantan on the Malayan east coast. The report was incorrect, but Phillips turned his force south toward Kuantan to investigate. This diversion would prove fatal. It kept the British ships within range of Japanese aircraft for additional hours and prevented any possibility of a dawn withdrawal to Singapore before the enemy could mount a coordinated attack. At 0010 hours on December 10th, Admiral Phillips sent a signal to Singapore requesting fighter cover over Kuantan at dawn. The signal went to the wrong authority. It was not acted upon. No fighters were scrambled. The Japanese attack came in waves, beginning at 1113 hours on December 10th. The attacking force consisted of 85 aircraft drawn from the 22nd Air Flotilla based at Saigon, a mixture of Mitsubishi G-3M Nell bombers and Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, armed with both high-explosive bombs and Type 91 aerial torpedoes. The torpedoes were purpose-designed for shallow water use and had been adapted for air launching from low altitude. Each torpedo carried a warhead of 204 kilograms of Shimozi explosive. They ran at a depth of approximately 3 meters after entering the water, traveling at 42 knots. The attack unfolded with a precision that reflected months of training and careful doctrine development. The Japanese pilots had practiced coordinated torpedo attacks extensively. They understood that the key was to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, forcing the defending ship to turn in one direction to comb the tracks of torpedoes approaching from one quarter while exposing herself to torpedoes approaching from another. A ship could not dodge in 2 directions at once. The Repulse was struck first, at 1113 hours, by a single bomb that penetrated the hangar deck and exploded in a Royal Marines mess space. The damage was manageable. Captain William Tennant turned his ship to comb the tracks of the first torpedo attack and successfully avoided all but one weapon. The Repulse, older but more maneuverable than the Prince of Wales, was fighting skillfully. The Prince of Wales was not so fortunate. At 1144 hours, she was struck by a torpedo on her port quarter. The weapon struck her precisely in one of the most vulnerable points any warship of her design could suffer, the outer port propeller shaft bracket. The shaft itself, turning at high speed, was bent and deformed by the explosion. It began beating against the shaft tunnel, each revolution punching fresh holes in the hull. The flooding was immediate and massive. In the first minutes after impact, the Prince of Wales took on an estimated 2,400 tons of water. The inflow could not be controlled. The pumping systems, however capable in normal circumstances, were designed to handle flooding from a single compartment breached in a conventional manner. They were not designed to handle a situation in which the flooding point was inside the shaft tunnel itself, deep in the ship, with access nearly impossible. The ship developed a list to port that would only increase as time passed. What followed over the next hour was a masterpiece of determined damage control that nevertheless could not overcome the fundamental fact that the ship was taking on water faster than she could expel it. The crew worked in flooded compartments, in darkness, passing hand pumps along human chains, shoring bulkheads, closing watertight doors that the flooding pressure was already threatening to overwhelm. They were doing everything right. The ship was sinking anyway. The anti-aircraft gunners maintained their fire throughout. The multiple 2-pounder mountings and the 5¼ batteries kept working, tracking the Japanese aircraft as they came in on their attack runs. The guns claimed at least 4 Japanese aircraft confirmed shot down, with others damaged. But the attacking force was large enough to absorb these losses. The Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with a discipline and courage that Admiral Phillips himself had not expected. At 1222 hours, the repulse was struck by 4 torpedoes in rapid succession, the result of a perfectly coordinated attack from multiple directions that gave Captain Tennant no possibility of maneuvering his ship out of danger. She capsized and sank in 8 minutes. Of her crew of 1,309 men, 513 were lost. The Prince of Wales received additional torpedo hits as the attacks continued. A second torpedo struck her forward, and a third hit compounded the flooding. She settled lower in the water with each passing minute, the list increasing, the pumps falling further behind. Admiral Phillips remained on the bridge. He made no signal requesting rescue for himself. At 1318 hours, the Prince of Wales capsized and sank. Of her crew of 1,612 officers and men, 840 were rescued by the destroyers. 768 were lost. Admiral Phillips went down with his ship. Captain Leach, who had survived a German shell passing through the bridge of his command at the Denmark Strait only 7 months earlier, did not survive this time. The destroyers, led by Electra and Express, moved into the oil-covered wreckage and began pulling survivors from the water. The Japanese aircraft, their torpedoes expended, had already turned north toward Indochina. The destroyers were not attacked. In the space of approximately 2 hours and 5 minutes of actual combat, the Japanese Navy had sunk 2 British capital ships, the most powerful vessels of the Royal Navy available in the Pacific, at the cost of 3 aircraft lost and approximately 19 damaged. The news reached London in the early hours of December 11th. Churchill received it in his bedroom at 10 Downing Street. He later wrote that in all the war he never received a more direct shock. He had not expected this. Despite everything the advocates of air power had argued in the years before the war, despite the experience of Taranto in 1940, where British carrier aircraft had crippled the Italian fleet at anchor, despite the lessons that were available for anyone who was willing to read them, there had remained in the minds of Churchill and much of the senior naval leadership a belief that a well-armed, properly maneuvered warship at sea could defend herself against air attack. December 10, 1941, ended that belief definitively. The shock was not only emotional, it was strategic. The loss of Force Zulu left the entire Western Pacific and Indian Ocean without a significant Allied naval force capable of standing against the Imperial Japanese Navy. Singapore, which Churchill had described in public statements in terms suggesting it was an impregnable fortress, now stood without naval cover. The Japanese could land troops anywhere along the Malayan coastline without fear of naval interference. The consequences unfolded with terrible speed. Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita drove down the Malayan Peninsula with a speed that stunned the defending British, Australian, and Indian forces, and Singapore fell on February 15, 1942, in what Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The technical lessons of the sinking were examined with painful thoroughness in the months and years that followed. The vulnerability that had proved fatal, the shaft bracket damage that had converted a torpedo hit into an unstoppable flooding, was recognized as a design flaw that could be addressed in future construction. But there was a deeper lesson that the loss of the Prince of Wales and Repulse had demonstrated beyond any further argument. The battleship, for 2 centuries the supreme arbiter of sea power, had been dethroned. The aircraft carrier, with its ability to project air power hundreds of kilometers from the fleet, had become the new capital ship. The battleships that remained in service throughout the rest of the war did so in a fundamentally changed role. They provided anti-aircraft cover for carrier task forces, they bombarded shore positions, they screened against surface attack. They did not face each other in the great gun actions that had defined naval warfare since Trafalgar. The guns that had been their defining characteristic, the massive caliber weapons that had required such extraordinary engineering to build and operate, fired relatively few rounds against surface targets for the remainder of the conflict. The Prince of Wales herself had embodied this transition more completely than any other single vessel. She had been designed as the ultimate expression of the big gun battleship, incorporating every lesson the Royal Navy had learned from 2 decades of technical development since Jutland. Her anti-aircraft armament, her fire control systems, her protection scheme, all of it represented the best that British naval architecture could produce in 1941. And all of it had proved insufficient. The quadruple turret problems that had plagued her in the Denmark Strait were never entirely resolved during her short operational life. The mechanisms were extraordinarily complex, and the compressed timeline of her working-up period had not allowed the crew to fully master their management. The civilian technicians who had been aboard when she fought the Bismarck had eventually left, and the ship's own artificers had become more proficient with the systems, but the fundamental mechanical challenges of the design remained. She was, from the day of her commissioning to the day of her sinking, a ship that was always slightly ahead of her crew's ability to operate her perfectly. In a different war, with more time, she might have been formidable. Given 18 months of sustained operations, with a crew that had worked up fully through every system and contingency, with the mechanical faults identified and corrected through accumulated experience, the Prince of Wales might have been the ship her designers intended. The war did not give her that time. The wreck of the Prince of Wales lies in the South China Sea at a depth of approximately 68 meters, approximately 50 nautical miles east of Kuantan, Malaysia. She rests on her side, the great hull that once housed 2,000 men, now home to coral and tropical fish. She is a designated war grave under Malaysian law, and diving on the wreck is controlled and in some areas prohibited. The wreck of the Repulse lies approximately 2 kilometers away. In 1947, HMS Wessex conducted a diving survey of the wrecks. The findings confirmed what the survivors had reported: the catastrophic shaft damage, the flooding pattern, the sequence of events that had made the sinking essentially unstoppable once the first torpedo struck its precise and unlucky target. The survey also confirmed the presence of the remains of those crew members who had been unable to escape before the ship went down. They remain there still. A memorial to Force Zulu and the men who died on December 10, 1941, stands in Singapore. The names of the 768 men lost with the Prince of Wales and the 513 men lost with the Repulse are recorded. They include ordinary seamen who had been at sea for less than a year, veterans of Jutland and a dozen other engagements, officers who had given their careers to the Navy, young men who had never seen combat before that morning. Admiral Phillips has been assessed harshly by some historians and more sympathetically by others. He was not reckless. He understood the risk he was running when he took Force Zulu to sea without adequate air cover. He proceeded anyway because he believed that the strategic necessity of doing something was greater than the risk to his ships. He was wrong about the Japanese capability, and right about the strategic necessity. He went down with his flagship, which was all that remained for him to do. Captain Leach of the Prince of Wales had already demonstrated both courage and sound judgment in the Denmark Strait. His decision to disengage from the Bismarck, facing criticism from those who believed he should have pressed the fight regardless of his ship's condition, was correct. His ship might have been saved on December 10th by a different approach of the Japanese aircraft, by fighter cover that arrived in time, by a torpedo that struck a different part of the hull. None of those things happened. He died with his ship. The broader consequences of December 10th reverberated through the rest of the war and through the decades of naval strategic thinking that followed. The United States Navy, which had lost its own battleship force at Pearl Harbor 3 days earlier, was forced by circumstance to build its Pacific strategy around the aircraft carriers that had been absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The result was a form of naval warfare that bore almost no resemblance to what the battleship admirals of 1930 had imagined. The great carrier battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf were fought at ranges of hundreds of kilometers, with the opposing surface forces never coming within sight of each other. The guns of the battleships were barely relevant. The Japanese, who had demonstrated so conclusively in the South China Sea that aircraft could sink capital ships, were themselves ultimately defeated in large part by American carrier aviation. The lesson they had taught off Kuantan on December 10th was one that the Americans absorbed more completely and more quickly than almost any other power. The fast carrier task forces that swept across the Pacific in 1944 and 1945, projecting air power against targets that no surface fleet could have reached, were the direct descendants of the doctrine that the Japanese torpedo bombers had validated over the wrecks of the Prince of Wales and Repulse. There is a final irony embedded in the story of the Prince of Wales. She was, in almost every technical respect, a better ship than her designers had managed to build before the war. Her armor was sophisticated, her machinery was powerful, her anti-aircraft armament was genuine. The problems she suffered, the mechanical unreliability of the quadruple turrets, the shaft vulnerability that proved so catastrophic, were the problems of a transitional design, of a ship that was pushing against the boundaries of what British industry and British technical knowledge could achieve in the late 1930s. She was better than anything that had come before. She was not good enough for what she was asked to do, and what she was asked to do, in the end, was to be unsinkable, or at least to be survivable against the best weapon that modern aviation could bring to bear against her. She could not be that ship. No battleship built in that era could have been that ship. The aircraft had simply progressed too far, too fast, and the doctrinal assumptions that had shaped the Prince of Wales from her keel up had not kept pace. She was the product of a world that was ending, sent to fight in a world that had already arrived. The wreck remains in the South China Sea, slowly being reclaimed by the sea and by time, a monument to the gap between what was expected and what actually happened. Every year, on the anniversary of December 10th, a small Royal Naval vessel puts to sea and conducts a brief ceremony over the coordinates where she sank. Wreaths are laid, the names are read. The sea is the same grey-green it was on that morning in 1941, when the first torpedo found its mark and the most modern battleship in the Royal Navy began the process of becoming history.